All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining our session on SharePoint 2013 product line architecture. We hope that you'll find this very beneficial. We've been working very hard on this for the past few months, so we're excited to have you here, and thanks again. Is everybody going to the Bon Jovi concert tonight? Excited? Day 2 at 9 a.m. I see a lot of bright eyes and ready to go, huh? All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Maybe. We have
technical difficulty.
I think you got to click into PowerPoint.
All right.
Hey, and recovery.
Nice.
We're the experts.
So quick intros. I'm Aaron Isom, a senior product manager with Microsoft.
Hi, everybody. My name is Thomas Nowski. I'm a delivery architect with services.
Hi, everybody. I'm Eric Sharon. I'm also a regional architect in our services group, and you can kind of see what happens to your avatar if you share it with a 7-year-old boy.
We only have 2 mics, so we're going to try to bounce things back and forth as efficiently as possible. But 2 quick housekeeping items. So feel free to share anything that you see today. We just ask that you use the hashtag for the session, which is SPC 007.
007.
Lucky draw there. So we want everybody to share in the experience. So feel free to comment and so forth. We're very interested in your feedback on this. This is a new concept we've been working on. So we're excited to hear what you have to say. So let's, if you can, hold all questions to the end. We have about 65 minutes of demos, no PowerPoint presentations. I'm just joking. We don't have any demos, actually. It's all about the details and the specifics. So, but just hold your questions till the end, and then we'll try to answer those as best as possible. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So the agenda today is going to be really focusing, I'll focus myself, will focus on the background, the vision, really what the program is all about. Tom and Eric will actually discuss the details and the specifics of what's in a PLA, what makes up a PLA, why you want to use the PLA concept, and then we'll focus on the benefits, the timeline, next steps, and a brief Q&A. So, how many of you have deployed SharePoint either in your organization or deployed it for a customer? All right, you're in the right place then. Every deployment you did was the same, right? You just clicked setup and let it run and install and walked away, right? It was easy, right? No issues. I doubt that very seriously. So you went to TechNet and you got some information and you deployed, right? Or you ran a PowerShell script that you created, or you did something, right? Or you paid a consultant, or you brought in a firm to actually do that. So many different ways of deploying, so many different ways of finding guidance and finding education, and different and mixed guidance. And there was my way, there was Eric's way, there was Tom's way. I bet we all have different scripts, right?
My way's the right way.
Yeah, I thought his was the right way. Come on. So, all deployments aren't the same. There isn't a one-size-fits-all, and we know that. But at the end of the day, we want to deliver something to you so that you can actually deploy SharePoint in a consistent manner, a prescriptive manner, and a very repeatable manner across the board, right? So you don't have a test farm, a dev farm, 3 production farms that are all unique for no reason, right? There's a really valid reason why they're unique.
So Aaron, I have a question. So how many people here are IT pro? So clap your hands if you're IT pro. Okay, got a couple of them out there? All right. So I'm assuming everybody here then has seen TechNet, right? You've probably read a couple pages about SharePoint. We've got maybe a few thousand pages of guidance. So quick question, first person raise their hand here. Where can you find the single page on TechNet that tells you specifically how to deploy SharePoint? So in other words, here are all the servers you're going to need, where services are going to reside, the configuration you should have, to basically stand it up end to end.
Front row, right there.
Yeah.
One of these guys in the front row.
Trick question, right? It doesn't really exist, right? We have lots of guidance, but at the end of the day, there really isn't a very, very discrete prescriptive guide on how do you get this done. We expect that you read everything, you weigh the pros and cons, and you come up with your own architectures. All right, so another quick question. How many people here are from the business side? Clap your hands. All right, so we've got a few business. All right, good. So have you ever wondered why it takes your IT department so long to deploy SharePoint? Clap your hands. Yeah, that's what I figured. So again, the reason because it takes so long is because it's quite complicated, actually. There's a lot of guidance. There's a lot of things to understand and know about the platform. It's a very broad platform. And so our goal here is to actually try to simplify that. And so you'll learn over the next couple slides our approach on how we're going to make that happen.
Yep, exactly, Tom, exactly. So, wanted to share with you some numbers about current SharePoint deployments. We still have about 24 million users leveraging SharePoint 2007 to some capacity, right? Imagine the deployments, the different scenarios that occurred when 2007 was released, because there wasn't a lot of guidance initially, right? So there are probably some limitations and some migrations and some scenarios out there that haven't necessarily been thought through from a customer perspective. So we want to get you to start thinking about, some of the challenges that you might experience and so forth, and think about how the PLA might apply to those scenarios to help. So around 50% of you have deployed SharePoint 2010 in the enterprise. So that's a pretty good number, and it's a pretty good deployment base. But now that we've released 2013, and with the new version of Office 365, and now being able to run SharePoint on Azure, there are even more possibilities, right? So how do we really go about deploying SharePoint in a consistent way across multiple platforms, maybe even on Azure at some point, right? With using the same prescriptive model. We think the PLA will go a long way in addressing that. We know it won't, like I said earlier, it won't solve all your needs, but we definitely think it'll get you started. That doesn't seem to work. So the current landscape is, as Tom mentioned, a lot of guidance out there, right? You can go to TechNet and you can actually read through many, many articles, but you may not find what you're looking for. You may blog about it, you may ask a colleague, or you may actually hire a consulting firm to come in and actually help you. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be the right way, right? What is the right way? Well, it really depends. And so the PLA really helps to address some of those challenges. We'll talk about some concepts later of a workshop that we'll walk you through that will help address some of those needs. There are lots of islands of best practices, right? Like I mentioned, each one of us has done, many SharePoint deployments, but we probably have our own way of doing something in that deployment that's unique, right? And we need to get away from that, right? We need to actually have a consistent, prescriptive way of doing things over and over and over again. So I think that the last thing that I wanted to touch on here is, there's a lot of guidance and there's a lot of architecture and planning and things that go into a SharePoint deployment that can be reduced to make the effort more cost-effective in the end. So that's another real key tenet to the actual PLA. Thank you. So our vision, when we started looking into this, we wanted to make sure that customers were focused on the business value that the platform provides in the end, right? As opposed to the platform itself, right? Why does it take 16 weeks to deploy SharePoint in one scenario and 6 weeks in another, right? Let's reduce that time to market so that you, the customer, and the partner can focus on really delivering the business value to the customer through solutions and different scenarios, as opposed to standing up the infrastructure over and over and over again. So, we focused on easy to implement, aligned with our cloud services, Office 365, SharePoint Online, making it as cost-effective as possible, and really driving repeatability, right? That was one of the fundamental pieces to this. You'll see over and over again is consistency, prescriptive guidance, and repeatability. So in the end, we came up with this concept called the SharePoint Product Line Architecture, aka PLA. We also have one under development for Link and Exchange for customers who are deploying those. So you'll see additional guidance on those. But in the end, we think that this will benefit you greatly. And I'm going to hand it over now to Mr. Eric Sharon to talk about the specifics of what's in a PLA.
Morning, everybody. So, as you heard, a PLA, the acronym stands for Product Line Architecture. So let's talk about, you heard the challenge space that we've had communicated to us as Microsoft from folks exactly like you about having you to design and implement SharePoint over and over again like you're painting a picture, rather than having an implementation methodology that draws together the best of what we know about SharePoint. and be able to implement that in the enterprise. So let's talk about the PLA as a means to solve that particular challenge. So what is the PLA? What's inside of it? What do you get with a PLA? So a PLA is a combined architecture that pulls together guidance from the product groups, or the people that write the software, and folks like Tom and I that are in services that actually deploy the software at customers around the world. And the goal is for us to bring together that information and to provide a sample architecture that allows you to, with confidence and consistency, deploy SharePoint. So the actual constituents of the product line architecture are kind of on the screen here. We modeled it a lot after defining a service for SharePoint. I think a lot of folks in the room have often thought about SharePoint as a service. It's really a collaboration framework or social framework that you're providing to your users in the business. So we took that message and lesson that we learned in deploying platforms like Office 365 and took a lot of that information and how we went about making that offering and packed it into the product line architecture. So in particular, the PLA has a service description. And front and foremost, for those of you that have read the Office 365 service description, understand that it lists out what the service is from a SharePoint perspective. It also says what we will enable and what we won't enable, and we'll get to that in the next few slides. It also contains a rule set. The rule sets are things in which how we govern the implementation of the PLA. Consists of a functional specification, which are those configurable elements for the PLA that allow you to adopt the product line architecture to your specific needs. The goal for us is not to define a monolithic architecture that's entirely inflexible. We understand that SharePoint has to be able to adapt to your own business processes, your own unique implementation patterns within your organizations. And then mostly it comes with a test plan. So the test plan is to validate the way that you've implemented SharePoint within your organization as part of the PLA, and to make sure that it can meet the needs and goals as offered by the service description within your environment. And we'll talk about those as well. And again, for us, it's very difficult to identify the different performance characteristics that they have in our labs from a PLA perspective versus on-premises. So we have service level objectives that we attach to the implementation of the PLA, and our goal is to work with you to develop the test plan to make sure that it meets as close as possible to the objectives. And we'll talk in specific detail about what those are. We also have sizing calculators and different configurable elements and an operations guide so that you can own, operate, care, and feed for the product line architecture in a very consistent manner.
So Eric, quick question. So is the PLA a product? Is it a device that we plug in? What is the PLA? I see a lot of stuff up here, but really what is it?
It's a great question.
So the genesis of the PLA is one in which we package, the best term is know-how, right? It's architecture, its patterns, its practices. It's a holistic method of deploying SharePoint consistently across hardware and software within your enterprise. And then we also give you the capability to, as I call it, care and feed for it. So right now, in its purest form, it's intellectual property. It's an amalgamation of what's out there on TechNet. It's an amalgamation of folks' knowledge locked up in the brains of folks that have written the product, and as well as knowledge that folks like Tom and I have for deploying the product at multiple customers for different use cases.
And most importantly, our knowledge around running the service ourselves. Right? So one of the key things that we have now is this wonderful thing called SharePoint Online, and that's allowed the product group to really understand how you all are actually using the product, and we run millions of seats. So all that collective knowledge now is getting fed back into the product and also getting fed into the PLA.
So the next question is, can I adopt the PLA? Is it for everybody? Is it something that I can hit a button and set up? Is it going to work for me 100% of the time? And the answer to that is it depends, right? So in order for us to be able to pull all of this information together but have it be useful for organizations, there are certain circumstances and certain assumptions that we had to make about the initial implementation of the PLA. So right now we're targeting users up to our organizations that are going to deploy up to about 300,000 users for an instance or an implementation of the PLA. And the reason why we targeted that is we took a look at many of our global customers that are deploying SharePoint across all of the capabilities that we're going to dive into that the PLA covers, and found that was actually a pretty common implementation paradigm. Again, we're not talking about public internet sites or or web content management scenarios. We're talking about collaboration and some of those other core concepts and work capabilities. So these are for new deployments or migrations or upgrades to SharePoint from 2010 and prior. And it's, again, the PLA is for those customers that are looking for consistency, they're looking for reliability and stability for deploying SharePoint. It's for those organizations that have painted the picture 25 different ways, have farms that look and feel and smell different to the touch, and are looking for a way for organizations to be able to implement SharePoint across different environments in the exact same fashion. So the next question is, well, what's inside of the PLA? So I understand what problem the PLA solves. I understand consistency. I understand reliability. I understand it's got all of this great Microsoft science inside of it. But how do I know that it's going to work for what I want to use SharePoint for? So that's part of our service description that we're going to get into in a second. But the idea is that the PLA enables core capabilities that we see customers deploy all the time together. So that includes workloads around social, search, customizations around SharePoint for using the new SharePoint 2013 application model. Collaboration is a core component, as well as authored content and publishing. So these are all areas in which the PLA has all of again, that engineering and implementation knowledge packaged up into a consistent architecture for deployment. So the service description and objectives. So again, let's dive into a little bit what it is that we're going to be able to provide from a PLA implementation perspective. So the goal is to provide core capabilities for SharePoint. So that includes social and collaboration. We call it a fabric, right? So it is a service. It's a platform that allows people to do things like share documents and follow documents and be able to interact with your communities and your newsfeed. It also provides a platform for the dispersion or the creation of sites for intranets, extranets, content authoring, workflows, and publishing. And then for us, it's one of the things that we went in with of our foundational element was that it's designed to scale. That even though we're targeting organizations that have 300,000 users, the goal is for not to implement the PLA and then when you reach a scale point, not be able to know how to scale that out. So we designed it with a consistent architecture for scale. So as we dive into the actual service description in of itself, we kind of aligned it to the way that SharePoint, our documentation in TechNet and MSDN talk about the core capabilities of SharePoint. So for us, content includes sites and collaboration. So for collaboration, one of the things we're enabling with the product line architecture, and again, when we say enabling, we're talking about the pre-configured, the pre-planned implementation of the architecture for SharePoint is to be able to allow for collaboration. That includes team sites, documents libraries, storage and versioning, metadata management, and workflows. In concert with that, the goal for us is to not to lock those things in place. Right? We have a firm belief, and we tell other customers that every document in every library should have a life cycle, one in which it just doesn't hang out and stay there forever and take up space in your implementation. So one of the core tenets behind that was to enable e-discovery, which is to allow you to configure a content life cycle that has in-place holds, content disposition workflows, and an ability to mature content from the place in which it was created to a storage or archive destination for records management and things like that. And then we're enabling Office web applications. The goal is for us to be able to give you a platform to enable search and the display templates and all the goodness associated with doing browser-based authoring and of documents.
So Eric, I have another question. So we've been talking about SharePoint as a service. So quick show of hands, how many people here have implemented the platform as a service offering, either within your organization or maybe for one of your customers? Okay, good. So in those implementations, did you have a service catalog, a service description document that really succinctly describes what you're providing back to your consumers? Yes? Yeah. So that's exactly what this is. So if you haven't had the opportunity to create that yet, this is going to be a great starting point that you're going to be able to hand back to your business units, your decision makers, and say, this is the product, this is the services and capabilities we're offering from IT, so that you can enable certain business scenarios to get value out of the platform and investment.
Thanks, Tom. That actually is an excellent point. I mean, some of the things that we're talking about here are setting boundaries around what you can do with SharePoint and what you can't do. And the basic method of service management is to be able to tell and publish to your constituents what you will do and what you won't do. And for those things that fall outside of what you're not going to enable, you then basically have to collect that information, determine demand, and then figure out if you can modify or create additional elements of the service to mature to achieve those. So for us in the web content management space, we are focused on single farm content authoring and publishing. So the product line architecture will have the capability for configuration-based implementations of publishing sites. So that includes sites that support the new publishing models, search and metadata-driven navigation and site publication, mobile device channels, dynamic content through search. Those are all elements of the PLA that will be that'll be part of your initial implementation should you choose to do the web content management. That also includes rich internet content, so video search, customized page layouts, CSS pages, master pages. These are all things that that you expect would, if you were to set up an implementation of SharePoint today, you'd be able to do. But again, it's in a much more of a service management container within the PLA. And we'll also enable other publishing capabilities. These are all configuration-based implementations of translation services and site mailboxes and things of that nature. From a social perspective, our goal is to, again, and this applies across all the PLA workloads and capabilities, is to do configuration-first implementations and shy away from intensive customizations of the platform. So the goal for us for social is to use all of these capabilities you see here in product, out of the box. So that includes the ability to provision personal sites for everybody in your organization. That includes document storage, integration with the Office client via SkyDrive Pro, news feeds, microblogging, user profile, synchronization with Active Directory in specific, and the ability to do profile completion and all the functionality associated with communities and news feeds. So very, very much from a feature perspective, all of the features are lit up for social in this particular implementation of the PLA. From a search perspective, again, we focus primarily on in-product capabilities. So the search will be implementing a in-product search center that's customizable from a branding standpoint. We are focusing on the ability to give you the ability to index multiple content sources, to fully configure search so that it indexes those sources. You have the ability to control when those sources are indexed. You have the ability to configure federated search and hybrid searches, as well as the crawl types and frequency, and even will also enable customizable query rules and graphical refiners. So again, very much a in-product, out-of-the-box implementation of SharePoint that is customizable from a look and feel perspective, but not from a code and capability perspective. There are several foundational elements for the service description that we also enable. So those include things like Active Directory synchronization that the PLA will support. That also includes host name site collections, SSL, and Windows claims authentication and authorization. So those are more foundational core elements that will be configurable with the PLA. And we also support application customization. So that includes all of the hosted provider models. So the idea was for us to gain flexibility and extensibility through an application customization story. That gets you away from modifying the PLA's implementation to suit your organization needs and allows you to introduce customizations that are off-box from a SharePoint farm point of view. So that includes the establishment of application catalogs, integration of business connectivity services, and SharePoint designer customizations. So those are all the things that are possible with the PLA. One of the things we wanted to draw attention to was also that some of the things, again, like any good service description, it talks about things that we won't do starting with our PLA implementation with its first release. And the goal is for us to grow this over time, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But the goal for us initially was to do something that a lot of organizations would be able to benefit from almost immediately. So one of the things we're scoping out of the initial implementation of the PLA is claims-based authentication. Claims authentication has a lot of consideration and a lot of variability, and the idea for us for this initial go-around was to go with more of a consistent approach, and that for us is to use Windows authentication, or Windows claims.
Yeah, so let me make sure everybody understands that correctly. If you've seen a few sessions from yesterday, we are very much supporting claims authentication. It's going to be Windows claims. There's 3 types of authentication options you have when you go to claims. You'll learn more about that all this week. But yes, we are definitely supporting claims.
Thanks for that clarification. This is things like SAML integration, SSO, federation, things of that nature. And our goal from an implementation perspective is to talk to you about using the PLA, but also pushing that farther upstream in terms of your identity management. So we're big fans of pushing protocol transition, Windows token acquisition after you authenticate in through your identity provider of choice well ahead of the PLA's implementation. And I think that's just a good general SharePoint paradigm in particular around authentication. Testing for host-based hosted applications is something that's not included within the PLA. So, for example, if we help you set up an architecture that's defined by the PLA, one of the things that we can't do in terms of planning and uptime and availability is predict how your hosted applications are going to react or perform, or increase or decrease the implementations of the flexibility and the performance of SharePoint. And that's one of the reasons why we work very hard to develop a test plan for your applications. Searching and indexing content or processing and relevancy tuning, those are very low-level implementations. They introduce a lot of variability into the implementation, and that's kind of antithetical towards what we're trying to do with the PLA. So those are things that were kind of out of scope for us. And as Tom said, Windows claims authentication is what we're going to support from a farm perspective. Cross-geo social implementations are out of scope for the PLA. They, again, represent an additional layer of complexity that we haven't seen used except in certain edge cases or for certain organizations. So those are going to be out of scope for this implementation, the first go-round of the PLA. And then public internet sites. Yet again, the PLA is designed to provide consistency, but the loads and variability introduced in a public internet-facing scenario is not something that we can support in a quote-unquote canned architecture that the PLA has. So from a service description or service level objective, the goal for us is to design an architecture that consistently has the ability to achieve 3 nines. So 99.9% availability is the testing goal. So for us, what that means is that on our testing labs, we implement the PLA and we throw load at it, up to the 300,000 user mark, and we kind of validate those 3 nines. Now, obviously, test plans are going to be instrumental because we want to make sure that we account for the variability in networking devices, traffic, DNS namespaces, geographical implementations of LANs and WANs, so that you can achieve as close to that 99.9% availability service level objective as possible. But we do know that topology and network performance are all factors that are well beyond our control. So the goal for us is to be able to provide you with best practice implementations and patterns for the PLA and work with you as you kind of implement the PLA to make sure that some of these areas of variability can be spotted and tuned from a network performance point of view. So, again, those things kind of highlight the variability of the PLA, and those are things that are kind of beyond our control. So one of the things that we've identified are what we call rule sets. They're implementations of rules that allow for us to be able to control or basically tell you what kind of performance or what kind of environment standards that you're going to need to implement the PLA. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom, who's going to talk about those things.
Thanks, Eric. So if we go back and revisit the primary objectives of the PLA, the primary objectives, really what we're trying to focus on is delivering prescriptive guidance on how to stand up a SharePoint environment to ensure a certain amount of reliability, availability, supportability, and reduce time to market. To do that, we had to think, how would we approach certain scenarios, certain environments, and recommend a certain topology or architecture that could achieve all those objectives. And to do that, we had to define some rules. The rules are basically more or less our requirements for what we need to ensure that we're going to meet on those promises or objectives of the PLA. So what we're looking at are things like, for instance, your virtualization platform. So certain virtualization capabilities that we do support versus capabilities we don't. Now note that I'm not saying one platform versus another. We're actually platform agnostic from a virtualization standpoint. And in fact, actually, we don't even technically require virtualization. Right. Good point. So if you choose to deploy a physical implementation, so be it. As long as you're following the prescriptive guidance, the rules are being met, we have no issue with that. Other things like topology. So for instance, we've heard now, I believe, if you went to Luca Bandinelli's talk yesterday, you probably heard that we're recommending the topologies are getting simpler, fewer farms, we want fewer web applications. These are all things that the rule set defines, and also the functional specification. So when we look at your existing topologies, and as we start to look at, well, is the PLA a right fit, and what do we have to do to get to PLA in your organization, we're going to be looking at your existing topologies to figure out how do we transition into the new architecture and the new recommendations. Other things like directory, so, example, how many forests do you have, how many domains, what does your identity strategy look like, your network topology. We talked a little bit about support for WAN deployments. So all those things combined basically define our rule set. And again, the rule set is so that we can ensure we get certain characteristics and behavior out of the PLA implementation. At the end of the day, if the PLA doesn't function, does not deliver the agreed upon service level objectives, does not have the availability we hope to achieve, and is not supportable, right, from a premier standpoint, product standpoint, then the PLA is not going to be a good fit for anybody. So the rule sets help us achieve that. So now rules, you might be thinking, well, geez, this sounds really restrictive. There's going to be only one way to do this. You don't know my organization. That's not necessarily the case. So the rule sets, some are going to be very prescriptive and they're going to be must-haves. For example, I'll give you one example. Virtualization, one thing we know we don't support in SharePoint is dynamic memory. Right? So regardless of what platform you're using, that's a no-no. Product doesn't like it. So that's a must-have. But then there's things like should-haves. Right? So we're going to make recommendations on, obviously, the service accounts you may need, and we'll give you some recommendations on how to name them. If you have a different naming standard in your organization, no problem. It's a should-have. Right? So we have flexibility in the architecture, and we'll help you understand as we introduce the PLA to you, what is a must-have versus what is a should-have. Okay, one subtle note though. So if we decide that ultimately, we looked at the PLA, the capabilities seem like they make sense, but for whatever reason, technically it's not a good fit for this particular organization, we want to do something custom, at that point, it's technically no longer a PLA deployment. And that's very important. The reason why we're trying to ensure consistency across deployments is because after this first round of introducing documentation and prescriptive architecture, you're going to start to see additional things coming out of the group around maybe automation, additional tools, things that are going to assume that the deployment matches the PLA guidance and recommendation. So does that necessarily mean that all this wonderful PLA guidance is out the door now, so the minute I have one rule that I couldn't meet, I'm not going to use this? Absolutely not. Remember what it is. It's a consolidation of all the best practices from TechNet, from SharePoint Online, from the product group, from services. So we should still always be looking at the recommendations we're making and why, and we should be using that even in custom deployments. So a couple examples. So again, this is a very abbreviated list. It'll be much more verbose as we release the IP. So from a virtualization standpoint, a couple examples. So we talked about overcommitting resources. So for instance, memory overcommit, high density core configurations from a virtualization standpoint. We're going to recommend that you avoid those. Live migrations, another example. So from a product standpoint, we recommend that you avoid live migrations from a virtual machine standpoint. Dynamic memory, that's definitely right now a no-no. If you're familiar with what we're doing with caching in this product or this release, it's very, very memory intensive, cache dependent, and the product really doesn't like that feature. So these are just some of the examples from a virtualization standpoint. Other categories could be topology. So you've seen the upcoming recommendations around a number of farms you should have. Very simple, one. So that's part of our topology rules, right? Content and services exist in the same farm. We're not, in this current release, going to be looking at stretch farms. Well, I should say from a product standpoint, ever. Stretch farms. How many people have actually deployed a stretch farm, just out of curiosity? Yeah, and that's generally what we find. It's a very complex architecture, very hard to support, has a lot of requirements that it was really hard to meet. So in this case, the product decided that we're not going to support those anymore. In addition to the new topology guidance, we're moving toward a consolidated, simplified web application architecture. Right? So logical topology is becoming simpler. And so we're going to force that through a rule set as well. And then finally, configuration. So some examples here, for instance, do not enable autocrate statistics on your SQL servers, setting things like the max degree of parallelism, disabling older versions of SSL that might be less secure. These are all configuration items, very specific discrete items across Windows, across SQL, across SharePoint that we're going to recommend as part of the overall architecture for the PLA. So it's going to be very easy for you to implement. You're not going to have to dig through 25 different TechNet articles and pages and blogs to say, well, is Windows configured in the best possible way it could be? Did I follow all the best practices from a SQL standpoint? What's going to happen when Premier runs a RAP assessment on my environment? Are they going to find a bunch of issues? If you follow all the guidance and you meet all the rules, you shouldn't have to worry about that.
And just to kind of interject, these are rule set examples, and they're very good examples. But what we don't want you to interpret this as is if I don't obey one of these, then the requirements around uptime and dynamic memory kind of go away. There are other means that which we can use to solve these problems instead of enabling like dynamic memory for virtualization, as an example. So the goal is for us to have these rule sets observed, but not to throw out the requirements that fuel these types of rule sets.
So not to get into the weeds, the topic of today is not to go through each individual item, but the idea here, the concept is we're making it simple for you to consume this to make sure that you can implement and follow all these best practices. Okay, so moving on to the functional specification, right? So this is sort of the meat of the PLA, right? So this is what you're going to be deployed, or what you're going to deploy. So it's a detailed deployment architecture, right? So this is a functional specification document that's going to clearly define your physical architecture. Right? So the number of servers you're going to need, tiers, the services that are going to run on those. It's also going to be your logical configuration, right? So what service applications are going to be configured, web applications, all the things that make up a SharePoint deployment. Prepackaged, very descriptive, in a document that's very easy to follow. It's going to be leveraging, again, all of our best practices and guidance across TechNet, across what we're learning in the cloud, across all the deployments we've done up to this point. Okay, it does cover both the logical and physical aspects of the solution. So again, we're not going to leave you hanging. So now that you have a basic SharePoint server farm up and running, how do I configure it? No, it's going to be right down to the point where you could literally start using SharePoint the next day after the PLA has fully been deployed. That's our ultimate goal. We want to take out all the complexity of the planning, design, implementation, shrink down the time to the point where you actually get value out of the investment. And again, reducing the guidance ambiguity. So if you've ever read our TechNet articles, we're very good about addressing certain questions with "it depends," right? If you've ever seen that, we're very good about describing individual elements of the solution. We'll describe maybe a particular service, tell you what it needs, how much demand on resources it has, what it does, but we really don't tell you how it all fits together very well. We tell you it can, and here are a bunch of different options of pros and cons, but we sort of leave it a little ambiguous so that you can come up with your own solutions and own approaches. What we're doing here, and not to say that that's not a valid option, you can still do that, but what we're doing here in the PLA is reducing the ambiguity. Right? So it's very clean, very prescriptive, gets you to your deployment faster.
The goal is to make SharePoint implementation less of an art form. Today, it's very much an artistic enterprise that you engage in. You go and talk to a bunch of people. You say, what do you want to do? You draw up your logical and physical architecture, and maybe about 4 months later, you're actually in production. Like Tom said, the goal for us is to take that out, make it more of a stamp-driven implementation of SharePoint that quickly allows you to implement core capabilities in SharePoint. And again, the guidance ambiguity is written as such, right? It's written to support your art form in deploying SharePoint. The goal for us is to not throw the encyclopedia at you or make you go to Wikipedia and be experts on nuclear fission, right? It's to be able to understand how to manage this particular implementation or stamp of SharePoint.
So with the functional specification documentation, you're going to get additional guidance, technical drawings. So some examples will be the logical configuration of how we're going to support all these supported workloads in the PLA through the new recommendations for topology, so single web applications with the host name site collection approach. We'll also have very prescriptive guidance on where you run services, how that all fits together with the service proxy groups, and how do we make this architecture work following all the new topology recommendations. So, question you might have, so we've noticed, or we've been mentioning SharePoint Online a few times now throughout the talk. So you might be wondering, well, is this SharePoint Online? Basically, did you just can up exactly what you're doing out in the cloud and now we're doing it on-prem? Technically, no. So our architecture out in the cloud serves a very, very, very specific need. Our stamp architecture and our need for scale at the number of seats we support wouldn't make sense in anybody's organization. If you think it does, see me after class because I'd love to understand what you're doing with SharePoint. But in essence, what we do is we've taken all the best practices and guidance and lessons learned out of running it in the cloud. We've looked at what we're doing from a service description standpoint to make sure we can offer the same types of services, but doing so in a way, in architecture that makes sense for your organization on-prem. Okay. One last thing to mention with the functional specification. If you've ever done a SharePoint deployment, you know that there is a ton of dependencies in your environment. All sorts of things that you have to have before you even start doing a deployment. And if you're in a large, complex organization, these things are owned by different groups within IT. Right? So now you have to work across a number of groups to make service requests for different things like service accounts, permissions, all the stuff that we needed before we even get started. Sometimes it was very hard to document everything that was needed. If you weren't very familiar with the platform, it might take you quite a bit of time just to figure all that out. What we're doing as part of the PLA is with the functional specification, which is your architecture, you're now going to have a very crisp, discrete bill of materials, everything that's needed to instantiate that. That way you can quickly go to your various groups within IT and say, okay, I need these changes for directory. I need these changes at the network level. I need to implement these changes with my firewall configuration. That way we take all the ambiguity out and again make it very simple to implement. All right, so some of the other things that we're going to get out of the PLA. If we were able to deploy SharePoint, but we left you in a situation where you couldn't run it, not good for you, not good for us. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we have some prescriptive guidance on how to operate and maintain the environment. Again, going back to our service level objectives, we want to make sure that you can achieve those 3 nines of availability at least. To do that, you are going to have to implement some sort of operations plan. And we're going to come to the table with that plan showing you what you should be doing to make sure you're taking care of the platform daily, weekly, monthly, whatever the interval might be. This is definitely going to be a requirement for hitting your service level objectives. If you don't follow the operational guidance, chances are it's highly likely you're not going to have that highly available solution that the PLA promises to deliver. And then finally, testing. So this is a highly tested, highly reviewed architecture by probably some of the #1 experts in the world on SharePoint. The people that make, the people that make it, the people that run it at millions of seats at scale, people that are deploying it all the time. But does that mean that we can just avoid testing when we go to deploy this? Absolutely not. So at the end of the day, we know that our test environments, our cloud, is not quite exactly the same as your data center. So what we want to do is we want to ensure that we're doing the appropriate level of testing after we've deployed. We want to make sure that not only is the environment functionally operational, we want to make sure that we're seeing a respectable amount of performance, that the user experience is what we expect, to make sure that you're going to be happy with the deployment after we're done. So we're going to give you a test plan. So we're going to take out that ambiguity. We're not going to say, well, you should test. Well, of course you should test. But here are the specific functions. Here's how you go about implementing a functional test. Here's how you would implement an automated performance test to make sure that what we delivered is going to meet your needs after we leave.
So yeah, the test is almost like a red light, yellow light, green light scenario. Because the architecture represents consistency, the test plans are fairly prescriptive and plug right into that architecture to allow us to validate whether or not the implementation as it's deployed will actually work as expected.
Okay, so moving on. So what are my options, right? Where do I start? So I'm really excited about SharePoint 2013. I want to move forward. Where do I begin? Our guidance is simple. We always want you to first look at what we're doing in SharePoint Online. The economics of the cloud, the ease of use, time to market, the availability, the service level that we offer in the cloud, that should be your first option. Explore it. See if SharePoint Online is going to meet your needs functionally, if it meets all of your requirements of your organization. If that's not an option, so let's say you really like the way SharePoint Online functions, it has everything you need, but maybe there's a regulatory requirement. Maybe you've got some sort of data sovereignty issue. You go, that's just not going to work for us. Your next option is then to look at, all right, I want to implement a PLA. I want a very prescriptive, consistent approach to deploying SharePoint, the quote-unquote recommended way that Microsoft would recommend deploying SharePoint. So now you're going to explore the PLA. The PLA doesn't meet your needs. So maybe, let's say, there's one of those scenarios where we don't address like publishing .com sites. Well, then now you're in the traditional deployment mode. So this again is really about doing your envisioning, requirements gathering, engaging with experts, doing planning and architecture, deployment testing, your traditional life cycle. So the options are very simple: cloud first, PLA, and then finally traditional deployment. All right, so now you've heard a little bit about the PLA. There's a lot of details that we left out. So how do you know if the PLA is going to be a right fit for you? The first step is to engage in an alignment workshop. The alignment workshop is really where we start to take a look at all those rules. We look at the capabilities. We look at the service definitions. And we figure out, is this a good fit for your organization? Are you able to adopt the architecture? What sort of blockers are in place? What sort of complexity and risks and amount of effort might be involved in doing a migration and moving to this architecture? We'll take a look at all those aspects, and we'll come up with an implementation plan to be able to give you the option of looking at how long it might take to implement PLA versus maybe another deployment option. At that point, we'll figure out what the gaps are. If the PLA is a good fit, we can move forward with deployment, and if not, then let's leverage some of that PLA guidance and move into a traditional deployment mode. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the benefits.
You can keep that. All right, so quick show of hands. I mean, who really thinks this is a great idea? Who wants to take advantage of it today, right? Awesome, awesome. I love it. So, I mean, this is something we've been working on, as I mentioned, we think it's really going to help us to work with you to deploy SharePoint in a much more repeatable fashion and make your lives a heck of a lot easier, right? So you can focus on your business challenges as opposed to worrying about the infrastructure so much. So at the end of the day, that's really what it's all about. And so, the benefits that you get are less time for planning and deployment, right? So we can focus on, after the workshop, making sure that it meets your needs, and then actually time to market, right? Actually deploying the services and deploying the foundation for you so you can really start focusing on your business needs and leveraging the solution as opposed to taking the typical 12 to 16 weeks or whatever to deploy the environment. The other thing is really focusing a shift from the infrastructure, keeping the lights on, to empowering your users, right? Taking advantage of, potentially Yammer integration and social features down the road, right? So that you can focus on those solutions or solutions that you've built as opposed to worrying about the infrastructure. And I think the most important thing here, too, is, as Tom mentioned, is the scalability, right? I mean, this is designed to scale to support most customer scenarios, right? Up to 300,000 users. That's a pretty large implementation if you think about it. Plus, given the new features and scalability scenarios in 2013, it's going to be tremendous. So, how do you engage, right? So once you leave here, what are the next steps? We'd like for you to work with us to either go through a workshop and see if it's the right fit, right? And if it's not the right fit, it still doesn't mean that you can't leverage the IP or the guidance. And I think, as Tom alluded to, we want to make sure that moving forward that the foundational deployment leverages this IP and guidance. And there may be a variance, even in the custom engagement, that we have to actually implement. But we're still, for the most part, 99.9% of the time, following that same initial guidance as opposed to having a custom implementation over and over and over again. And so, as this program evolves, it is evolving. We're still in the early stages right now of putting everything together and finalizing it internally. But as it evolves, we want to get feedback from you. We want you to interact. We want to make sure that we're providing the necessary guidance and the changes and aligning with what you need as we move forward so that we can actually update those rules and so forth to align with additional services that 365 provides. So if you're a partner, we want to work with you as well to co-deliver this with customers to make sure that we're actually providing some training and readiness and so forth as opposed to just handing over the IP and saying, go deliver. We want to make sure that everybody is following the same consistent model as opposed to just random deployments and so forth. So timeline. I mentioned that we're working on this internally. We're wrapping things up very aggressively. So right now we're in beta form, internal review, and we plan to very, very shortly after the beginning of the new year kick off a CTP, which we're terming Community Technology Preview instead of Consumer. And we're going to really at that point start broadly releasing this content and getting much more feedback and actually seeing it in the field and actually being adopted. And then the 1.0 release, the official release, is planned for the March timeframe of 2013. And at that point, at the end, I'm going to show you a slide where you can get more information and feedback and so forth. But we want you to communicate with us. We want to get your feedback. We want you to understand that we want to work with you, and we'll push out as much information as possible as we release it. So some next steps. This is the email. And we wanted to set up a Yammer account. Unfortunately, we were a little bit late in the game in getting everything set up, so we decided to set up an email to start with. This will change, and we will set up a Yammer public so that you can actually share amongst yourselves and make comments and feedback. We want you to participate in a preview release. So once that preview is ready, we want you to provide feedback and get involved, engage with either our services organization or a partner to deploy this. And then finally, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to your partner account manager or your services sales team and get us engaged to work through the workshop.
So Aaron, if I want to get involved in the CTP, just send an email, say, hey, I'm ready to adopt, let's do the PLA?
Absolutely, yeah. So what I suggest is everyone here who raised their hands, please send an email to this, and I will get I'll get you signed up for the Yammer public network, and we will provide constant communication on next steps, releases, and so forth as we move forward. Great question, Tom. So with that, I think we're ready for Q&A. I'll just mention, please fill out your evals when you get a chance. But we'd like to just take the last 10, 15 minutes or so and answer any questions, whether they be technical or about the program, those kinds of things. Yes, please. And if you could, I think the room's loud enough, but maybe step up to the mic. Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question was, we're well ahead of the curve here. In our organization, we're deploying SharePoint 2013. We're already coming up and defining our service description and coming up with our architecture. How can we work with your team to make sure that hopefully we're following some of those recommendations and best practices before we publicly release some of this information? Great question. So what I would recommend is that you reach out to the alias, you send us an email, and then as soon as we have information to share, we'll figure out what's the best method to share that.
Yeah, and we want you to actively participate in that and provide feedback. So as Tom mentioned, send questions, and as soon as we have something that's ready for release, we'll send it out for distribution.
Another question. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Question.
Hey, this is a great program, thanks. Many of these elements in the PLA seem like they should be part of an effective governance plan, at least the IT control side, not necessarily the fluffy policy side.
Right.
Is there a similar or complementary initiative inside of Microsoft's program to have this work hand in hand with an entire governance plan? Because again, some of that
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way that Microsoft thinks about these things is that we're investing in public, hybrid, and private cloud scenarios. And part of any cloud-driven scenario is one in which you have a modicum of IT service management. So absolutely, we're working to align the architecture with our existing governance documentation. But what you can expect as part of this is that supportability model in which we're going to provide IT service management type capabilities. Again, we're describing a service, we're helping you implement the service, and then the goal for us is to leave you with a manageable service. And part of that is being able to own, operate, and care for it, aka govern it. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're thinking about this at the PLA level, and there's a lot of implementations of governance and IT service management considerations going on at Microsoft at multiple levels. Probably first and foremost is the sophistication of the governance that we have in Office 365. Our goal is to, as part of the PLA, and a continued effort, is to transform that governance and make it applicable to customers like yourself.
So is your team owning that governance plan piece, or is it a separate adjacent team?
For us, and again, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, we are focused on consuming that guidance and helping contribute to it within the context of the PLA. So it's actually, within Microsoft, it's kind of like a two-way street. So we consume guidance that's coming from a level of sophistication like Office 365. And part and parcel of involving services in this is that we see what customers need to go through to own and operate the SharePoint platform. So we're constantly pulling and pushing information across the governance stack at Microsoft.
And so to add to that, so the PLA, if you think about it, the PLA is basically your foundation. Right? It's the foundational service offering. There are additional services that we offer to enable capabilities. We call them service offerings. So for instance, there's a social service offering. So if you think about it from a governance standpoint, the PLA team will own governance at that foundational level, right? So it's mainly, primarily, a lot of the technical governance. But then as you go up the stack, you look at the solutions, if you will, that are being applied on top, there's an additional layer of governance that applies just to those capabilities and services that those teams have to define. So it's really a multi-team effort to really come up with the all-up governance plan for deployment of SharePoint.
Question, you talked about single farm topology.
Yes.
I understand stress farm not being one of the very common topologies, but multi-farm topologies, they're not being supported by this initiative?
Good question. So the question was, we mentioned topologies and we mentioned, hey, we're going to a single farm architecture. Is it not supported by the PLA or maybe even not supported by the product? So I can answer both those questions. So one, does a product support multiple farm architectures? Yes. Technically you can do that. You can share services like you can today. We are being very prescriptive around asking customers to try to avoid those scenarios because of the complexity in management and operations of these environments, where we feel that the benefits of having a multi-farm architecture do not outweigh all the costs and risk and complexity. So the PLA aligns to that recommendation because, again, this is the product line architecture, right? And we're saying don't do that. The PLA is going to help you establish a single farm architecture that's going to meet your needs. And that's another great point. So if you look at all of our TechNet recommendations right now around the product, you look at the technical drawings, we still have the traditional multi-farm, services farm, content farms. In 2013, we do. Yep, absolutely. You're 100% right. That guidance is changing. So we are updating a lot of that guidance. You're going to see a lot of new information on that subject.
Like somebody else just said, it's a bit late in the game to release that in the second quarter of 2013.
We definitely understand that, and we're not saying that you can't do a multi-farm topology. However, we want to make sure that you're aware of some of the complexities, caveats that we address through the simplified architecture that we're recommending.
So just to add on to that, so I wanted to separate those two concerns. So the concerns are that our guidance is changing around overall what our philosophy is around farm implementations and topologies for SharePoint. And then beneath that, we have the PLA that kind of consumes that guidance and implements it. So for the PLA, why we're focusing on single farm architectures initially to start is because we want to take the art form out of planning your SharePoint implementation. So when you start to think about multi-farm topologies and cross-geo-social scenarios, there's a lot of art and science that has to go into prescriptively planning that for your enterprise. A lot of orchestration, a lot of analysis of network bandwidths and traffic patterns and things of that nature. We wanted to be able to provide a canned architecture that allows you to, like Tom said earlier in the presentation, be able to plan it and then implement it in a quick fashion. If we start to expand that into multi-farm architectures, we're in what Tom called a traditional deployment, which means that we're going to have to do a whole bunch of homework to be able to get you into a cross-geo scenario or multi-farm scenario even. I think we had a question over here, and then we'll head to the back row.
Good question. So the question, make sure I understand it correctly, is the PLA, production architecture, prescriptive architecture you're going to use in a production environment, or is this just proof of concept because we're seeing different recommendations on TechNet and the traditional models don't seem to align with what you're recommending? So absolutely, this is a production architecture. Right? So this is what we're working on with the product group to make sure that this architecture will work at scale. If you've seen a couple sessions yesterday talk about topology changes, yesterday's session the last session of the day, I don't remember the session number. Luca Bendinelli was one of the speakers. Luca Bendinelli, he introduced the concept of the new topology and the consolidated approach we're going with. It absolutely will work at scale. There are a number of tiers and a number of servers in the environment. Even though you're a single farm, you are going to have a number of instances of SharePoint servers running to make sure that you can scale appropriately. And this is very much a production architecture we're recommending. Right, so the idea is you're physically one large farm. Your farm is divided into very discrete tiers, right? So each tier has requirements around latency, certain services it runs, and then what we do is we scale out by adding additional instances or running servers to each tier.
Something like active port, 80 ports, spanning out of 4 users, other than whatever necessary
Sort of, but it's consolidated, yeah. So it's one farm. It's one farm that has a very prescriptive architecture with tiers and a scale-out approach to make sure that it'll scale to 30,000, 100,000, 300,000 users.
But just one real-world scenario which you excluded in your PLA, which is public-facing websites, right?
Yes.
So this is a real-world scenario where you would look at maybe 2 farms, right?
Correct, right, and that's that.
So in that case, do you then prescribe a shared services farm? Because then I start to understand this, but...
Yeah, and so a good question. So the question is, one of the scenarios you've de-scoped in the PLA is public.coms and publishing scenarios. So in that case, if we're deploying a .com site, would we recommend a multi-farm topology, and then how would you do shared services across the both? So the answer there is, in that scenario, we would definitely have to do a custom deployment for the .com side. Right? So you could do a PLA deployment internally to enable collaboration in the internal workloads. And then what we're going to have to look at are your requirements for your .com. More than likely, it's probably going to make sense for a separate farm because you're probably going to want to isolate that out somewhere on the edge of your network, depending on what your architecture looks like. Depending on what services you need to share, it might just be a consumption of the PLA farm. It might be isolated services running in your .com farm. All that, again, because that's really hard to define in a pre-canned architecture. So that really requires us to come in and help understand your requirements so that we can recommend the best architecture.
That's a nice implementation to you, so that's XNet, public-facing websites, anything.
Well, even at its core, the question is if I have an architectural/business reasons for more than one farm, we're telling you to combine everything into a single farm, service applications and content databases and things of that nature. And I have another farm, whether that's web content management, that might be records management, e-discovery, and I need to subscribe to or consume a UPA. I need to consume the search service application or whatever it might be. How do I do that if everything's all in a giant farm? So the product group and us as the folks that are working on the PLA kind of talked about all that. And what it came down to, or what it boiled down to, is that there really isn't a benefit other than increasing the application architecture complexity to be able to subscribe to services in a cross-farm scenario. So you could take out search, like your search service or UPA, and put them in a centralized farm and consume them. But in this rev of the product, in our planning and our reevaluation of how we're telling customers to do this, the added complexity of managing that tertiary service farm doesn't really benefit you in a way that you can't automatically from farm B consume farm A's service applications. So our goal is to go from a simplified model. Instead of deploying 3 service farms or SharePoint farms altogether, have one search or have one service farm and have other ones subscribe to that one. Right? So it simplifies. And again, that's not going to be for everyone. I think we have one question there in the back. I want to go to the back row. Nope, no questions back there. Let's go
Other side.
Yep.
How about the scenario where you have a lot of full trust code and you don't want to put that on your main farm? Is that a scenario where you might have
That is definitely a scenario. I think, in terms of, so the question was, what about full trust code? Is that an isolation boundary in terms of splitting out farms? And in my mind, the answer is absolutely. But the question around full trust code kind of begs another discussion, which I don't want to get into here, which is why do we have so much full trust code? Can we migrate that full trust code to a application hosted platform so that we don't actually have full trusted code running in SharePoint? So I would try to validate that. And certainly there's going to be business reasons where that full trust code is supporting actual business process and can't be deprecated, rationalized, or moved out. So, but that's where I would start with that discussion. Right here.
Is this going to be available strictly as a paid service offering, or will customers have the ability to access this body of knowledge as a free service offering, or strictly paid service offering?
So the question is, the PLA is going to be this repository of knowledge and patterns and practices. Do you need Microsoft guidance in a paid model to achieve this panacea of SharePoint goodness, or can you consume it outside of services engagement, right?
I'll take that one. So the short answer is yes. So the initial plan is that all of the IP and guidance will be through a services engagement, either with services or co-delivered through a partner. And that's primarily because of the whole new concept, right? And so I see this evolving over time and being released publicly over time, but not initially.
Just a quick clarification question. We're currently working with Microsoft. We're working with one of your partners to develop an architecture for SharePoint. We're already well engaged with the ecosystem. Would there be a way of getting access to this information and bypassing the typical engagement process, because we're already engaged with you right now?
Yeah, so I would suggest, chat with me afterwards, send an email to this alias, and we'll work with you to try to figure out a solution. So we want to try to be as flexible as possible. One thing I wanted to address really quick is about the production ready. So we believe so heavily in this program that we're investing, in Link and SharePoint and Exchange product line architectures, as well as some other products that actually have a corresponding online service. So this isn't going away. This is something that we're really investing heavily in, and you're going to see more and more of this.
Question right here.
Just can you talk a little bit about how disaster recovery fits into this model?
Yep.
So the question is about disaster recovery. Tom, do you want to take that?
Yeah. So obviously disaster recovery is an important element of a production service. And so we are looking at disaster recovery in the first release of the PLA. However, it's not going to be the traditional, highly available secondary data center architecture. For the first initial release, we're going to look at the SLAs or SLOs for recovery. And we're probably going to go with a much higher RPO, RTO with a simplified approach for disaster recovery so that a majority of our PLA customers can implement. So one of the things that we found with DR, not that I don't recommend you don't have secondary redundant infrastructure, but a lot of times a lot of customers don't have that. And then even if they do, standing up the DR environment, maintaining that as well, testing it periodically, all that's additional cost, complexity. So the first iteration, what we wanted to have is a simplified DR approach, business continuity plan. In future iterations of the PLA, we're probably going to approach the more sophisticated architecture, multi-site type DR scenarios. But for right now, it's going to be single site.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Just following up on that test certification, development, same kinds
So I didn't follow that question.
Typically, we'd have a certification environment, so we're going to get a latest patch. We're going to have to apply a server patch. We don't throw that on our production farm in case it blows something up.
Right.
So same type of answer then, talking about other farms, they would basically be separate instances of...
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So from an operations standpoint, the question is, if I have a PLA, will I have multiple instances of PLA to support pre-production scenarios? And absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So from an application lifecycle management standpoint, you'll need that. From a patching and operations standpoint, you'll need that. And so the idea is you'll definitely be instantiating multiple PLAs in pre-production.
Let's take one in the front.
Okay, one more?
Yeah, can you comment on the performance testing tools that you guys are going to provide to validate the PLA implementation?
Good question. So the first iteration, so the question is, what kind of performance testing tools will we be bringing to the table as part of a PLA deployment? So the initial release is basically performance test plans. Right? So we'll be looking at, what are the use case scenarios, the personas, the test mixes that we should be running against a PLA deployment. Further iterations of the PLA will hopefully leverage some additional scripting and tool capability with Visual Studio Team Test. We'll probably pick up some dependencies there. But the initial iteration is just going to be the plan, so to help you work with either your internal testing teams or implement your own test scripts, but that'll be the first iteration.
Yeah, just to add to that, so nothing is set in stone, but we mentioned earlier that there will be some later on automation to this, right? So as we go through the automated deployment mechanism, there will be validation built into that. So at the end, I imagine a dashboard that says validated and off you go. But those are still being worked out, and unfortunately, it's going to take time just to build this. So. I think that's it. Any last questions? I think we have time for maybe one last one, if anybody has anything.
I think the big one was yesterday, which was Luca's discussion about the topology. We have to get that session number.
Yeah, so yesterday's topology session was big.
LUCA. Luca B.
Yeah. Thanks for attending, guys, and please send emails if you have any